Gary Ridgway was an unassuming truck painter in Washington state. Over the course of 2 decades, he murdered at least 49 women, though investigators suspect his actual victim count is closer to 80. Ridgway operated without a sophisticated plan. He was a suspect who stood in plain sight, interviewed by police multiple times, and even voluntarily handing over a saliva sample as early as 1987. So how does a remarkably average factory worker carry out the deadliest killing spree in U.S. history and manage to slip through the fingers of law enforcement for 20 years? The answer lies in a sociological concept known as the less dead. This term describes marginalized groups of people who society, and by extension the justice system, deem unworthy of attention, resources, or protection. Ridgway understood this dynamic perfectly. He exclusively targeted these exact individuals, hunting for teenage runaways and street-based sex workers along Washington state's Route 99. He didn't stay free for 2 decades because he outsmarted the detectives. He stayed free because he preyed on a class of people that society had already discarded. Psychological profiles categorized Ridgway as an organized killer. He experienced deep cognitive dissonance, claiming a strict religious morality while compulsively murdering women. He deliberately picked sex workers because their profession forced them into isolated situations where they could be easily overpowered. The legal environment of the 1980s played right into his hands. Police departments treated street-based sex work as a public nuisance. Vice squads ran oppressive sting operations, treating the women themselves as criminals to be arrested, rather than citizens in need of protection. This strict criminalization built a wall of terror between the victims and the police. Sex workers who survived brutal attacks or witnessed abductions refused to come forward or share intelligence, knowing that talking to a detective would likely end in their own incarceration. The situation was so desperate that detectives actually sought advice from another notorious killer. Sitting on death row in a Florida prison, Ted Bundy offered to consult on the Green River case. Bundy accurately profiled the suspect. He pointed out that the murderer was taking direct advantage of the massive blind spots created by local vice laws and the victim's intense distrust of authority. A legal framework explicitly designed to police public morality had inadvertently handed a prolific serial murderer his greatest tactical advantage. The investigation remained stalled until 2001, when forensic science moved from analyzing large biological stains to identifying microscopic trace evidence. Forensic scientists gained access to PCR and STR DNA testing. Polymerase chain reaction and short tandem repeat analysis allowed investigators to take a microscopic, degraded fragment of genetic material and rapidly replicate it until the entire sequence became readable. Using this method, lab technicians sequenced trace amounts of semen recovered from the earliest victims. They ran that code against the saliva sample Gary Ridgway had confidently provided 14 years earlier and found an exact match. Confronted with irrefutable physical evidence, his mask of the quiet, unassuming factory worker shattered, leading to his immediate arrest. Hard science succeeded where traditional police tactics failed, but only after decades of preventable deaths had already occurred. To avoid the death penalty, Ridgway agreed to trade the locations of his undiscovered victims for a plea deal, resulting in 48 consecutive life sentences. Today, he sits in an isolation cell inside a maximum security prison, while forensic teams are still working to identify the remains of his victims decades later. But this tragic timeline isn't unique to the American Pacific Northwest. It reveals a devastating global pattern. In the United Kingdom, Peter Sutcliffe's, known as the Yorkshire Ripper, murdered 13 women throughout the late 1970s. The police's dismissive attitude toward sex workers led them to ignore key witness statements and openly tell the public that innocent women weren't at risk. In Canada, pig farmer Robert Picton killed dozens of women. Authorities routinely ignored missing persons reports and clear warnings from the community, entirely because his victims were marginalized drug users and sex workers. Across different nations and different decades, the formula holds true. Whenever law enforcement stigmatizes a specific community, serial predators operate with devastating impunity. If criminalization actively creates a hunting ground for killers, how can society permanently dismantle it? We can look to the New Zealand model. In 2003, the country passed sweeping legislation that fully decriminalized street-based sex work. By treating the sale of sexual services as legitimate labor, the law recognizes the inherent human rights of the workers. It completely removes the threat of arrest from their daily lives. This change addresses the historical power imbalance. It allows workers to step out of the shadows, build functional trust with local police, and share intelligence about violent customers without risking their own freedom. Forensics can close a case, but dismantling the legal barriers that isolate the less dead removes the very hunting grounds that serial predators rely on.